Be it resolved that short-term medical missions is good for us and bad for them. Let me start by thanking Jean for being willing to participate this evening, and for all of you for choosing to attend. I believe collegial debate, and I'll continue to stress that, collegial debate is a great way to explore important issues, and I'm very pleased that this is looking like it will become an annual event. Last year, I was given the less controversial side of the argument, but this year it falls to me to risk offense, and I will be defending the proposition. But how can anyone be against helping others? Generations of Christian doctors and dentists have spent time in the developing world, and CMDS considers such activities vital to our kingdom work. How can I suggest we are doing harm? The first thing I would point out is that it's not just I who suggest our approaches to places like Africa are failing miserably and have caused a great deal of harm. I don't know if any of you have read the book Dead Aid, written by an African who is educated in the West, suggesting that a great deal of harm has been done. She's quick to point out that over $1 trillion worth of aid have flowed into Africa with essentially no progress, and actually what's happening is the opposite, that countries most recipient of aid continue to get poorer and continue to get sicker. And obviously there is something wrong. And she explains at a macro level what has gone wrong. Why is this happening? Why have governments messed it up so severely? And missions organizations and development workers on a smaller scale have begun to ask the same question. We've been at this a long time. In a lot of places we don't seem to be making progress. Why is this the case? Why are we not seeing success? And are we on a smaller scale wreaking the same havoc that our governments are wreaking on a larger scale? Part of that, of course, is that development aid, especially direct-to-government development aid, has become a resource, like diamonds and gold, a resource that's worth killing for, a resource that's worth overthrowing governments for. And the countries that have chosen not to pursue that aid, and the countries that are fortunate, perhaps, not to have rich natural resources, seem to be the ones doing the best. And that's an entirely different discussion. So, it's time for us to face this question. So I'm going to deal with the easier part first. That's what academics do. And so let me deal with the first half of the resolution, which is that short-term medical missions is good for us who choose to go. With very few exceptions, exposure to medical and dental practice in the developing world provides those who go with tremendous benefit. There's little debate about that. Professionally, you see pathology that just doesn't exist here, thankfully, and are challenged to push your skills. You're reminded what the good that medical practice can do. Your next grand rounds goes really well. Lots of attendees, you've got great pictures, you've got great stories, and you're a favorite at departmental meetings for some time after, because you can regale them with all your stories of pathology that they have only read about. You've made a difference, you've done good. Personally, you realize how blessed we are, and you feel good about your self-sacrifice. You can go for a lot of months of selfish behavior riding on a trip to Africa. You can justify a lot with what you've done for the good of the planet. Spiritually, you either get to see vibrant faith, if you're in a part of the world where Christianity is well-rooted, or you get to check off the Great Commission from your to-do list if you go somewhere where it's not. Right? That's gone. You're good for years, probably. So there's no doubt that going there is good for us, and it's certainly something we encourage the students to do, and generally, bar with few exceptions, which usually have to do with poor planning and other such things, is a very positive experience. The question we need to face, which we're challenging you to face tonight, is whether it's good for those that we go to minister to. I'm going to start that discussion by reading a song. Now, I read the song because singing the song does not fit my giftings. I read better than I sing, and so I will attempt to do this. But you have to imagine a very beautiful African children's choir leading off the song, and then in the chorus, this is Jars of Clay, and the song is Light Gives Heat, for those of you who know, and those of you who don't can go home and Google it, and it's much better sung than it is read, but that's the best I can do. So the song starts with a lament. Catch the rain, empty hands. Save the children from their lands. Wash the darkness from their skin. Heroes from the West. We don't know you. We know best. This is not a test. You treat me like I'm blind, setting fires around houses on the hill, but light gives heat. You segregate my mind, burning crosses from your fears. The light gives heat. It's not the way to light their way, boys in holes and empty fields. Oh, how good it feels, lower class and understate, empty promises, empty plate. Moving from lament to prayer, the singer turns to Christ, acknowledging that he's the one we need help from if we're going to do better. Will you teach us how to love, to see the things you see, to walk the road you walked, feel the pain that you feel? At your feet I kneel. I want to see you shine. See your light, not mine, because light gives heat. Your light gives heat. It's time to acknowledge that our well-intentioned activities in the developing world have sometimes caused a great deal of harm. We parachute into a place we don't really understand, do stuff we think will help, talk about our faith, and then go home. And when we leave, the communities are worse off than if we had never come. They are worse off physically and spiritually. We'll start with the physical. I think of the way that free clothes from the West have wiped out indigenous garment industry in large parts of Africa. I think of the small mosquito net manufacturer wiped out by a flood of free nets. Of the African doctor who has to close his clinic and move on when North American doctors set up a free clinic down the road, unaware that he even exists. These stories are tragic in many ways. There is the immediate financial harms of the jobs lost by those whose businesses can't possibly compete with charity. And then when the charity moves on, there is the harm caused by the lack of local resources to continue making nets and clothes and doing medicine. The greatest physical harm that our short-term activities cause is reinforcing a cycle of dependency. People were sick. White people showed up, and people got better. They had magical cures and pills and needles that locals had never seen before. Then they left, and people got sick again. What's the solution? We need those white people to come back, do their magic again, because we certainly can't do what they do. There's no point in local people trying to fix the problems because the solution lies outside the local context. A few of the local children may apply themselves, be inspired by us, and actually graduate from medical school, but they won't go back. They move to where the money and the professional support is. They escape to join us. We think we've achieved something because we've got pictures. We've got pictures of the people we treated. Here's the people we made their lives better. What we don't see is all the people who continue to suffer. And if we hadn't taught them that they can't help themselves, hadn't taught them that we know best, hadn't taught them that help always comes from outside, maybe they wouldn't still be suffering. The second half of the harm we cause is the spiritual harm. Conversion may take an instant, but growth as a Christian takes a lifetime of mentorship. Transforming a non-Christian worldview to a Christian one can take generations. What can you do in a few weeks? Well, what you can do is tack a little Christian lingo onto the local religion. To please the powerful Westerners, those whose ongoing charity is the only way to improve their life, the locals, may pay lip service to Christianity. Or perhaps the conversion is genuine, but it will be very, very shallow. During the Rwandan genocide, Christians slaughtered Christians. Tribalism and survival were far more deeply rooted than any Christian theology that the missionaries had left behind. Some of you are struggling with this. You're quite upset with me, and that's okay. This is part of what I do for a living, if that upset provokes thought. If you have angry email, send it to me, not the national office. These thoughts are my own alone. You think of the great work being done, and you can all point to examples of where real progress has been made, where real work has been done, where good things are being achieved, and I would challenge you to try to think of a short-term missions project that has achieved that. The only scenario I can think of where short-term relief actually does much of anything is disaster relief. When there are tsunamis or earthquakes or unusual disasters, it makes sense for a lot of people to show up and do help. But that's disaster relief. That's not really short-term medical missions. Where there are successes, they are generally because somebody has invested a great deal of time and personal energy into understanding the locals and working with the locals and building with the locals, and there is nothing short-term about that commitment. There is a role, I think, if you need to go there briefly, to provide relief There are people there working very hard who would love a week or two off. Or to provide education. There are people there working very hard who would love someone to come and talk about all the different things, all the knowledge that we have. Call that short-term locuming. That's what we call it in Canada. Call that CME. That's what we call it in Canada. But it's not really short-term medical missions. There is a role to going there with humility to learn and being thankful for what you gain. That's an educational elective, not short-term missions. We are called to minister to our neighbors because they are the ones we can most effectively minister to. If you want to do good, do it where you are, in a context you understand and that you are committed to in the long term. I'll end with an anecdote from another Christian musician who is now actually with the Lord. Rich Mullins loved nature, and when his success allowed him to, he bought a very nice place in a very beautiful part of the southern U.S. It happened to be next door to a native reserve, and several reporters later asked him, "Oh, when was it that you felt called to do ministry among the natives?" And his response was, "Well, it's a really pretty place, and it turns out the natives are my neighbors. Turns out the neighbors are natives, so I guess that's where I'm going to be doing ministry." But he didn't go there to do that. God has all called you to somewhere, and you will have neighbors. I hope Christ's love flowing through you motivates you to get to know your neighbors, to know them deeply, and to care for them deeply. If you do that in time, you will have opportunity to move them closer to Christ, and that will change the world. Thank you.
A little shorter here. Dan and I both wanted the podium a little lower here. I want to thank the organizers for this opportunity. Of course, it's always a little daunting to be asked to speak in the place of John Patrick, and let's face it, nobody here would want to do that. So thanks for asking me. I was actually in Africa at the time, and I think I just, the time zone or whatever, and I somehow said yes. But really, I am thankful for the opportunity to be here. I'm also thankful to British Airways for getting me back. We actually weren't supposed to get in until today, but we flew to Montreal a week earlier, having stayed already 8 days in the UK. So pardon me for my jet lag and my culture shock, but anyways, I'm privileged to be here to address this important issue tonight. Well, as my opening statement, I would say that short-term medical mission works provides medical skills, both procedural and managerial, equipment and resources to some of the world's poorest and most inaccessible people to medical care. If properly carried out, it can empower and train some of the local medical staff to be able to perform appropriate procedures and treatment long after the team has left, leading lasting change in the community. So let's look at some of the facts about short-term medical missions. And I would say that I myself participated in several short-term medical trips before I became a long-term missionary development worker, whatever you want to call it. First of all, short-term medical missions provide services that are otherwise not available due to the lack of skilled personnel in areas of work. I particularly think of cataract work, which is done by several organizations, including MMI and I believe MS as well. And these are often carried out in remote areas that are very underserviced by the country's medical system. Secondly, short-term medical work, missions work, can provide services to people who can't otherwise afford it, even if their own medical community is available, and they can't access it due to economic reasons. And again, living in a place like Uganda, realizing that most parents fear to bring their children or their families to the health facilities because of money. It's a real impediment for many people. People are relieved of long-term disabilities who can then positively contribute to their own communities and families. I think of the Christian Blind Mission and the cleft palate work that they do for many young children. A child with a cleft palate will basically be an outcast most of their lives if indeed they do suffer, or if they do survive. And if they're prepared, obviously they can join the community and become productive citizens. Short-term medical missions can be organized in such a way to train local health workers to carry out basic procedures or preventative treatments. They can help to build on the skills of the local health workers so as to augment what is already in place. I think of the fistula surgeries that happen in northwestern Uganda. There's a neurologist who comes on short-term mission trips to this area, And even though the surgeons in that hospital are actually doing fistula work, they can only do very simple surgery. So when this fistula doctor comes from the UK, he helps the surgeons there to increase their skill, as well as, of course, treating women who have these very complicated cases. I think of MMI, who's training local doctors to be ophthalmologists, and part of their training is actually to participate in these camps that they have. I think of my good colleague from Hamilton, Dr. Reilly, who goes to Mongolia and is really raising the level of gynae-oncology care there, and in fact helped to discover a gene, ovarian cancer gene in that population. So there's been some very good work that has come out of organizations and groups that are working in short-term mission. I would be very blinded to say that there are no challenges about medical missions, and I want to just deal with a few of those that my opponent has already briefly talked about. I think one of the most important things that we always have to recognize, and that is daily in my face living in Uganda, is that there is a cross-cultural engagement. When you go from where you are to another country, you're going to be exposed to differences in beliefs about who's in charge of life. Most people just say it's God's will. You know, my brother died, it was God's will in many developing countries. The organization of authority. You know, the oldest doctor is always in charge, and it doesn't matter if he is competent or not, he's the one in charge, and you just go with what he says. And I dealt with that in Yemen. Very frustrating, but you have to recognize that that's a cultural issue. The use of time. I'm trying to get back into Canadian time. I was on time today, don't you know? But that's a real issue in many parts of the world. And then the role of the group versus the individual. So people participating in short-term medical work who have not prepared for these cultural engagements can do harm if they're not prepared. But the same is true of sending a carpenter to go do cataract surgeries in Honduras. They're a trained person, but they aren't trained to be doing that particular thing. And so as part of our short-term medical missions, we need to appreciate that we need to be trained how to deal with these cross-cultural issues. In our society, in terms of time, we're a very monochronic society. In other words, time is limited. You know, you're all expecting that we're not going to go to 11 o'clock. If we were in Uganda, we could go to 11 o'clock, no problem. So we're very limited in time, and we see time as a resource, versus in most global south developing countries, time is seen as limitless, and really it's relationships that's more important. It's more important that you sit and listen to Dr. Jean talk on and on. Just kidding. But I'm just saying that any of you that are out there listening, you're thinking that, yeah, no, you're going to finish at a certain time, or you're just joking, right? But that is how in the developing world time is thought of. In terms of how we view ourselves, again, as a society, again, in North America, we're very individualistic. You know, it's important your personal achievements. How many surgeries did you do on your short-term mission? Who are the employees of the month? Versus in developing countries, it's a collectivist culture. In other words, we're looking for the well-being of the community. I can't tell you how many times somebody comes to my door who I don't even know, who's getting married, and I'm supposed to donate to this guy getting married. But that's how it is. It's a collectivist society. He's got to get $300 together to get married, so we all have to work together to be part of that. And so loyalty to the group is more important. So these are really very important cultural issues that we need to be aware of. And if we're not aware of those cultural issues, then this leads to this ethnocentric thinking. In other words, our culture is better than theirs. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard people not come right out and say that, they're pretty close to it, that we are better. But we need to remember that as a North American culture, we're actually extremist. We are very monochronic, and we are very individualistic. And the Bible certainly supports all four of those different types of points of view, but it criticizes some parts and it supports others. So we just need to be very sensitive that we're not ethnocentric. And then finally, poverty is seen as a deficiency. There's this mentality that we're sort of giving something to somebody. We're giving to the poor. And of course, if you only have 2 weeks to give something to somebody, you're a little bit in a rush. And really, all of us instead need to see ourselves as poor, whether we are materially poor or unpoor. All of us have broken relationships, and all of us, God calls into reconciliation with His Son for all parts of our lives. And I just think of a dear gal that I met in Zambia who had HIV, and she had a fistula, and this was about 14 years ago when I first started my career, and I was out there on a short-term trip, and her mother was with her the whole time. And I remember she actually left the hospital. Unfortunately, her fistula repair broke down. I mean, I thought I was a hero. I was trying to repair this girl. Both her mom and myself had actually donated blood so this girl could have surgery. But you know, when she left that hospital, I, the great surgeon, hadn't cured her, but she went home with her mother, who really was the one who was going to bring her through this time, and I'm sure she's with the Lord today. But instead of me thinking of her as being deficient, as being poor, it was really that mother who was the one who really had the assets. She had the gift to be able to give that I would never be able to give to this dear gal. So again, the three challenges: cultural engagement, ethnocentric thinking, and then poverty is being seen as a deficiency. So my recommendations would be that state short-term medical missions work as an extension of local organizations who can take the responsibility for what is going on, and that they are part of the implementation and they're part of the actual planning of the work as well too. I think even of our program, we were going out to a community, and finally the community said to us, you know what, you guys need to come in the afternoon. Our women are digging in the morning, and it was important for us to hear that. So they're part of the planning and helping us to be effective. When we think about the profit of the trip, we already have these predefined goals, and the emphasis is on procedures instead of people. I mean, how many cataract surgeries did we do instead of how many people's lives were impacted? And so if we're only looking at profits, then in a short-term, 2-week time, we're not really seeing the assets. What can that community give to help themselves? So it's very important for us to look at what can the communities give, even if we go and set up a short-term trip. What can they be doing? Well, they can be providing food, sometimes they can be providing transportation, sometimes they can be providing housing for us. But of course, sometimes we don't really want to take what they are offering us because it's not quite up to our standard. So that's the challenge that we need to look at from our point of view, is seeing what assets the community can give us and being willing to embrace them. One example I think of is there was a group that had gone to Guyana to build a church, and about a year or two later they got a letter from the church saying, the roof of the church you built is leaking, can you come back and fix it? And you just think to yourself, no, you fixed your own roof. But obviously what had happened was that people were just already expecting that they were going to maintain, these American groups were going to maintain it. So people themselves really need to be able to see their own assets. We also need to be aware of spiritual warfare as well too, that when we go into these places that there's a lot of other things under the radar that we're not even aware of, and it's important for us to be spiritually aware. So near the conclusion here, I just want to emphasize the fact that as members become involved in short-term missions, that it's really important, medical missions, that they have prepared themselves through courses like perspectives and that sort of thing. And that you be able to see the limitations of what you're going to be able to do instead of having these great goals that really are not going to be realized. And short-term medical missions is most effective if it's followed up with subsequent visits. And you can develop that kind of long-term relationship with the local people. Benefits of short-term missions, medical missions to Indigenous cultures and communities is great. People are cured from lifelong disabilities and are able to have these productive lives, avoiding the snare of poverty and ill health. Thousands and millions of people have been impacted by short-term medical missions and will continue to be if we are prepared ahead of time, if we go equipped with this spirit that is one that is poor in spirit, and finally, if we leave our paternalism at the door. Thank you.
This is where it gets fun. So it sounds like if you spend lots of time preparing and you go humble and you're willing to go back again and you're willing, it starts to sound not so short-term anymore. It starts to sound like long-term work. And I think that is the point that I would wish to stress this evening, is that if you think that you can give 2 weeks of your life to this, and that will make a huge change, it will change you, hopefully for the better. And the first thing it'll change is you'll realize how little you can actually achieve in 2 weeks when you're dumped into a culture you don't understand. And hopefully you would realize that quickly before you do too much damage. And develop some humility that you didn't arrive with quickly before you do too much damage. And as I said, it is benefiting you. But if you think that you are the hero from the West who will make it all well, you're only going to make it worse. If you're willing to put the time into it here, and if you're willing to go in humility, and if you're willing to make a long-term commitment, you can change the world. but it's not them anymore. You've become one of them, and it's now us. And us together are making a difference. And if you see it as I am going to become one of them, so that we together can work together, I would agree that you can make great difference, you can make great strides, and there are people in this room who have achieved that. And their sacrifice is certainly laudable. And there are others of us who need to come alongside them and help. But 2 weeks will not allow you to achieve much of anything. It's interesting, though, that I think the veneer, one of the things that when I struggle with this, I think about is how when I was in Africa, it seemed that the Western culture, Western religion, Christianity, was a very, very thin veneer, which had been painted on top of everything that was there before. And when the lights went out, and again, doing OBGYN, I knew what happened when the lights went out. Everything went back to the way it used to be. And people were very good on Sunday mornings about living out what they thought Christianity was supposed to be. And then on Friday evenings, it didn't go quite so well. The irony, of course, is that I work in rural Ontario, where Christianity is becoming a thinner and thinner veneer. And many people know what to do on Sunday morning, and Friday night it doesn't really apply. So perhaps one of the things you can learn as you're in the developing world and seeing how the way that they view the world isn't really Christian, and yet Christianity is a thin layer on top, hopefully that causes you to reflect a little bit on how perhaps how you see the world is not all that Christian, even though there is a very thin veneer painted on top. So does it help you? Definitely. And if you're willing to make a long-term commitment, you can help them. But nobody can be a hero for 2 weeks. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to point out that my opponent's quotes were basically looking at the issue of aid and not necessarily just medical missions. So I think we need to look at those numbers and tweak them for how much money is actually being put into medical missions. And certainly there's been a lot of mistakes that have happened in terms of aid, and I would agree with that wholeheartedly. But even as examples of mosquito nets and clothing and that sort of thing, those are aid issues and not necessarily those of medical missions or medical care per se. I would agree that there has been some, as I say, some bad planning that has happened, and I think there's been poor engagement with locals, and that was just the focus of my earlier discussion. Was it's very important to engage with the local people. I would argue as well that even if it's only 2 weeks that you yourself are contributing, you could be part of a bigger group of people who are actually engaging more deeply with the local people. And I agree that if you're only going for 2 weeks, you won't be able to do that. But you can be part of an organization that has already made that kind of engagement and friendship with people in the developing world as well, to wherever they happen to be. He talked a little bit about relief versus rehab versus development, and I might actually argue against that point that really development is a very important area for medical missions to be involved in, short-term medical missions to be involved in as well too. I already cited these examples of where we can actually go in and train people to do the surgeries, because at the end of the day, that is who we want to do it. And quite frankly, some of these surgeries, cleft palate, cataracts, other types of specialties really require that kind of assistance from outside, because clearly the countries within themselves don't have that kind of training program. So short-term trips can do that. I would half agree with him, his point about short-term, that it is in some ways what I'm presenting is a bit more of a long-term, but the long-term doesn't necessarily always have to be you. Someone else can take over from your particular contribution to a short-term trip. So in summary, I would argue the fact that the challenge with medical missions is how are we engaging with the culture, and I think we can do a better job of that, and I think that's one area that medical missions can also improve. Thank you very much. So to repeat the question is whether dental work is included in the comments. And I would say from my side, as seeing medical admissions, short-term medical admissions as a positive, I would definitely say there's huge needs for dentists, again, to do training. I see my friends in Uganda going to the dentist and they just have their teeth pulled, that's it. That's the end of it. And I think there's a lot more that could be done for dental work for sure. But training specifically.
Yeah, I think I would take a little more holistic view of what medical means. Medical, again, being MAC people, being the biopsychosocial totality of the person. And your mouth is an important organ. So when I said medical, I included dental and all the other areas of your body that need to be addressed. And I would say again that if you're going for 2 weeks, and you're going to do a bunch of fillings and pull some teeth and then leave without building any capacity on the ground, the same harm can be done. Yes, right. So the statement made was that we don't go to offer expertise. We as Christians go to be poured out as a love offering to the poor, and that we are called to do that. And wherever we are called to be, we are called to be the love of Christ, the hands and feet of Christ. And I would agree entirely. It's interesting that Christ spent years with only 12 guys, and they still didn't get it. And one of them killed him, which I think speaks to speaks to the need for long-term commitment. One of the wonderful things about the church is that, as Jean has said, you may be a small part of a big thing. And if you're a small part of a big thing, I think a lot can be accomplished. And that's the wonderful thing about being part of the church, is you are a very small part of a very, very big thing. And if you are going in humility, and I hope that every day in every interaction, wherever God has put you, and whether you find yourself in the developing world or the developed world, you are being the love of Christ there. And that there is no way to be Christ's hands and feet and walk in arrogance, and to walk not in humility. And if you're called to go there for 2 weeks and to just love on everyone who's there, and you go in that and walk in that humility, I think you'll accomplish some small part of something bigger that you probably have no sense of. But that's a little different model than what I was arguing against. If you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I think having said that, God does give us a mind to think and to use our resources. I mean, how many of us, as we walk out the door, are going to give our whole life savings to Save the Mothers or some organization like that God needs to get to? You know, God gives us a mind to use our time, to use our talents, and I think as we think about short-term missions as well, too, we need to think about strategically. When you think about a mission group, I mean, I travel with them every time I go back to Uganda. There's always 20 kids sitting in the British Airway airplane heading back to Uganda. So for a short-term trip of some sort, and arguably, sometimes I'm not sure those kind of building projects and all those kind of things have really thought through what they're doing. And again, I would argue that's different than the medical missions, where you're actually going and you're giving a skill that cannot be gotten there. I mean, there's guys sitting around waiting for work, and we're sending over people to, you know, build houses. And again, I'm not condemning all of those situations. I understand there's other reasons for them to go, but I think if we're thinking we're sending those people over to, you know, help the local people, that guy wanted a job. He would gladly build that house for $5 a day. So I think God has called us to use our minds, to utilize our time and resources.
Okay. So the question which was asked was if we could comment, well, I think both of us will, on what the role of a learner is, a student going. Both of my developing world experiences were as a learner. First as a medical student doing an elective in Swaziland, and then as a resident in St. Lucia. St. Lucia was rough. Yes. Very different. There's a huge difference between the Caribbean and Africa, with one notable exception, which recently got hit by an earthquake, and bad things got worse. I think I went there seeing the experience the same as when I went to Sault Ste. Marie in Dawson Creek, where I used all of my elective time to travel. That I was going to learn from more experienced healthcare providers in a different setting than where I was learning currently, understanding that the different setting was a huge benefit to me as a learner, that it stretched me in different ways, and also that the fact that I was going to see things that I wasn't going to see where I was. But I went, again, not expecting to be the hero who would change anything, but going as the learner, expecting to be changed. And I think if you go with that attitude and are appropriately partnered with those mentors, some of those people in this room taking you there or mentors on the ground, it does a great deal of good for you, and then hopefully you are changed in a way that you can do good for those that go there. I certainly didn't think when I was in Sault Ste. Marie that I was some sort of medical hero to be going there. I was a learner going to a different setting entirely for my benefit. And I think if you go, you need to go with that understanding.
I don't know if it's right to agree with your opponent or not at a debate, but I will agree with and again, I've interacted with a lot of students, and I think I do agree with them that it is just very important, the spirit that you go in. I get lots of emails from students wanting to do electives overseas, and they want to come and do a big, huge research project, they want to do this, they want to do that, and they don't realize the time that it takes for me. I kind of have to be like a little bit of a mother to them. I know they never would admit that to them, but if you don't, like there's hazards in a place like Africa that you just don't have here. You know, you really have to look after somebody. So in addition to the busy things that I'm already doing, I now have somebody who I'm 24/7 responsible for. So I think really going with that sense of humility that, you know what, whatever you want me to do, I'm happy to do. Just give me that opportunity, you know, what do you want me to do now kind of thing. And not to have unrealistic expectations that you're going to do a multi-randomized controlled trial in 6 weeks, because that really a lot of students have, and I appreciate that, and there's a lot of pressure on people now to do research when they're overseas, but I would hesitate to say that really anything substantial is going to come out of those little short-term research studies. So again, just having that humble spirit and an expectant mind, and preparing yourself. And I have to admit, I never prepared myself. I wandered over to Kenya in 1991. I don't think I ever remember, getting the book out and really understanding what are the issues that I would be facing there. And in retrospect, I realized, I missed a few things. So really, I would encourage you, no matter who you are, to do the time to prepare so that you know what you're getting into, understanding the culture. I mean, a perfect example, when I was in Yemen, a man does not shake a woman's hand. If you put your hand out to shake a woman's hand, and that's a very strict Muslim culture, but I mean, if you're going to a place like that, and you put your hand out, immediately you have already disqualified yourself in that person's mind, because they realize, this person doesn't know what's appropriate here. So it's worth that investment.
So the question was, could we comment on the medical specialist coming to upgrade the skills of the local person? And I think we call that CME in Canada. And you are all here getting CME credits. And CME is incredibly valuable. And as someone who works in rural Canada, I enjoy when I get a chance to hang out with subspecialists and they improve my skills. And I think doing the same in the developing world is immensely valuable. Not short-term medical missions.
Yeah, I would agree with Michael that it is short-term, and certainly there's been some great courses organized. And again, this is what I'm trying to emphasize, it's the planning. Every year, I'm sorry I forget the organization that orchestrates that big conference in Kenya, but it goes every 2 years, once in Kenya, the next time it's in Thailand. And it's basically CME for docs all over Africa, and they all come flying in. And it's a great social time for them, but they also are upgraded on their skills as well too. But that's the kind of organization, it's everybody can benefit from it. It's not just one little doc out in Eldoret or whatever, it's everybody is benefiting from it. So I think that's the kind of thinking that we need to have in medical missions. We need to be smarter about what we're doing with our money and with our resources. I mean, you drag Michael across the world to come and teach, cardiology course. There's only kind of a couple people he's talking to. It's a waste of his time, sort of. So it's really important to have that kind of organization And that's a really good use, I think, of short-term medical. And again, I've been sort of these rural areas as well too, and you're always kind of wondering, like, am I on side of this or not? Like, am I doing the right thing here or not? And so sometimes they may be totally doing the right thing, but just to go and hear it really makes you, have more confidence in yourself as well too. So thank you.
All right, so the question put to me was, what is the harm to spending 2 weeks vaccinating, given that they only need one vaccine across their life? I think the harm depends on how the locals perceive what you're doing. If what you're doing is perceived as assisting primary health care locally, it's part of an entire primary health care package that is delivered, I think that there is great benefit. I think if it's seen by the locals as a one-time, isn't it odd, this person from the West came and gave us all this shot, now we won't get polio, that's wonderful. You have done benefit. There's a lot of kids being born, and if you're not back within 5 or 6 years, you have lost herd immunity. And so one wonders what you've achieved something for them. The harm would be if when you leave that village, what they have learned is that what prevents this horrible disease called polio, again, I can't say the white guy, but the Western guy, the Western guy came and fixed that. We've had polio for generations, and it's been wiped out by this hero from the West, and now he's gone again. And 5 or 6 years from now, we lose herd immunity. Nobody thinks, well, maybe one of us should be distributing polio vaccine. If what they've learned, if you've reinforced that cycle of the solution comes from outside, then yes, a bunch of kids aren't going to get polio. A bunch of other kids are going to get polio. What you need to build is the ability to give vaccines in the local population.
Oh my goodness, I have to agree with my opponent again. And I would actually make the point that in terms of vaccinations, now if you're just going as part of a group and it's more of a tourist thing or whatever, that's fine. But vaccinations need to be a national program. They need to be a national program. People in the villages need to understand, when my kid's born, I take them to the clinic. And if you happen to be the person there standing there giving the vaccine, great. But it has to be part of the system that's going on there, because if you're not, then the exact cycle that he's talking about is going to happen.
Is a willingness good enough? A willingness is a start. And I think what organizations like CMDS can do is come alongside and give you the more stuff you need. So I think if you stand up and say, I am willing to go, the first thing that you should ask is, what do I need? And hopefully your willingness leads you to what you need and then to go. So like Jean, I just got on a plane and dropped into Swaziland. And this very nice doctor said, welcome, Dr. Reilly. And I said, no, I'm a medical student. You're a medical student? Yes, I am. Welcome, Dr. Reilly. Here's your phone. Here's the nurse that translates. We're all taking a week off. You're here for 4 weeks. That's good. And there were 60 patients lined up to see me. I had not yet done my OB-GYN rotation as a clinical clerk. And I spent a lot of time reading. And people often ask, that must have been lots of fun. And my answer always has been, it was a good experience. It wasn't fun. I was not prepared. I had no idea. And a week in, there were a couple Brits and an American, and we were hanging out together. And a week in, I had mentioned that metronidazole was what we had to treat whatever I was treating that week. And the American leaned over and said, oh, doesn't that cause birth defects? I don't know how many lots of that stuff I had given to pregnant women in a week. And so I momentarily, until I got back to my textbooks and realized it was about beagle pups and it's okay in people, it's not so good if you're a beagle pup, apparently. I had thought, oh my, I've just caused this. Still 9 months from now, there's going to be an outbreak of birth defects in Southern Africa, and it's all my fault. And thankfully, I had the textbooks with me. I had the foresight to bring textbooks. Willingness got me there. I think the experience taught me that it takes more than willingness.
I'm not sure what job willingness is the only requirement for. By the way, I didn't get into master medical school either. Yeah, they didn't didn't let me have an interview, so I don't know where my heart's at. But anyways, I was willing. But anyways, coming back to the point, I mean, even in the Bible, you look at Paul's instructions about who a deacon should be, who an elder should be. You know, he's supposed to have his house in order, he's supposed to this, he's supposed to be that. Sure, there were lots of people who wanted to be deacons, who wanted to be elders, etc. But no, you had to have your house in order, you know? And so I don't think willingness is the only criteria. And sometimes people feel a little bit, you know, pushed, well, we should let so-and-so go. But really, I think if somebody isn't willing to go and work with the Nationals and to have that spirit, then the Nationals they always keep a smile on their face. They always keep a smile on their face, but you know, and having lived there long enough now, once you turn your face or your back they're just talking and they're like really resentful. And so there's where real harm can come. So I would emphatically say that willingness is not the only criteria needed.
My answer to that would be that if you want to spend a few $1,000s on your child's education, this is a great way to do it. Train them before, send them, and it will be of great benefit to them. And we certainly spend lots of money bettering ourselves. Is it better to have sent the money there? Gets you an entire debate about resource allocation and the fact that we all consumed a great deal of food this evening, and I'm an ethicist, and I love to tell students that even what you ate for breakfast, I could subject to ethical analysis. There's some interesting stuff on Tim Hortons. We'll maybe go there tomorrow morning. If what you want to do with the money is make a difference, then give it to the locals. If what you want to do with the money is make a difference here, it may be appropriate to spend it. But recognize that that's what you're doing with the money, and call it that, and don't call it something else.
But I would argue that there are certain skills that you just can't purchase. You can't purchase an ophthalmologist in the middle of Congo. You can't purchase a urogynecologist in the middle of Uganda. So there are definite skills that we are fortunate enough to be trained here, not all of us, but some of us with particular skills. So it's not enough just to send money in that kind of situation. So, but again, always thinking, how do we train people locally? So whether it's sending money or whether it's investing in training local people, I think we just always have to have that in the center of our long-term objectives for short-term missions.
So I think what Roger is attempting to say is that the first 2 weeks of a long-term mission commitment is short-term medical missions. Fine.
But I would say that those first 2 weeks of a long-term mission are very different than the 2 weeks of a short-term mission. The first 2 weeks because for most people, it's a frustrating time. You're in a house that you don't know, you don't have any water half the time, you don't have power. You're going out to try and get your medical license from some little hole in the wall down there. They don't like the transcripts you have, they want the originals, they want it signed. And you're spending just a lot of time surviving, let alone if you have little kids. We have 2 4-year-olds and a 6-year-old, so you're trying to prevent them from getting malaria, eating the worms on the ground, whatever. So I think that culture shock but also just the safety, particularly of your family, is paramount. But then, as I say, it's the logistical stuff. So that's the beauty of when you go short term, you don't have to spend a lot of time doing that kind of thing. But if you're there for long term, you do have to spend the time doing it. And if you don't do it, then you're always kind of 2 steps behind. Is that kind of... I think for most people too, maybe not the first 2 weeks, but there's somewhere along the line where you think, what am I doing here? What am I doing here? Because you come across, again, these cultural differences where you're just looking at your local colleague and thinking, what are you missing or what am I missing? This isn't working out. And those cultural changes or exchanges are always going to happen, whether you're short-term or long-term. That's it.
So the point being made for those at the back of the room is not a lot of time, perhaps that's the fault of 2 academic types sitting at the front, has been paid talking about the individual and some beautiful stories of individuals whose lives are radically changed. And I think the point is well taken that there are places where people with specific skills do make a huge difference. MMI being a great example. The gift of vision changes everything in the developing world. And I think if you can go and make that huge difference, It's interesting that when this comes up, people talk about organizations, right? MMI. MMI is not a short-term project. All of these things are not these are organizations that you're connecting with who are going to follow. There is a huge amount of work to be done. And one of the great things that you get out of going is coming back knowing that this little boy whose name was this, his life is better because I went and did that. And that's a reason to go, certainly. And the key thing, I think, is to make sure that in helping the individual, you're not harming the community. And perhaps that is something that the locals, with their collective way of seeing the world, can teach us. Yet another thing we can learn from them.
Because some would argue, should we spend what $20,000, whatever it costs to send 10 people to one of these countries? If we had spent $20,000 training a doctor in that country, could they then have helped those people? So, but I agree with Dan that if there's specific skills that are missing in a community, then that's really our role as expatriates, whatever you want to call us. But again, always thinking about still how do we empower that community so that they can help themselves in the long run. Because you can be guaranteed, if you go back to those villages now, again, there'll be people with needs. So how can we help over the long term to have those needs met on an ongoing basis? But the individuals are very important. And again, I mentioned the point about cleft palates. I was just at CBM's fundraiser this week, and I had tears in my eyes. I mean, you see these little kids with cleft palates, and you think, you know what? Those are the kids I see in Uganda, and when you live there, you almost become a little bit hardened to all the disability that's around you, because every day you'd be in tears. And when somebody comes in and cures that kid's cleft palate, when somebody comes in and helps a kid to start to walk because he's got contractures or whatever, definitely those lives are changed. But how do we scale that up is the challenge, and I think we just need to be thoughtful about that. So, and MMI is a great group to do that. So.
The point is made that one of the great benefits to taking people there in the short term is that they develop friendships and relationships that become long term. And certainly the world is a much, much smaller place than it once was. And my son doesn't see geography the way I see geography. He doesn't see national boundaries the way I see national boundaries. He doesn't even really see time the way I see time. Because he is instantly connected to people all over the planet and is chatting with them as we are chatting in a way that still boggles me and must really boggle those who are older than me, because at least I saw this coming in my youth rather than not. But the digital natives, the generation coming, you can take them there for 2 weeks and they will be in communication with that place for the rest of their life. One of the great, General Rick Hillier, I had a chance to hear him speak. Who was Shake Hands with the Devil? Yeah, Romeo Dallaire, sorry, I got my generals mixed up, I'm sorry. Made the point that somebody asked, a school teacher asked, we've got $5,000, what can I do? And he made a great suggestion. He said, well, buy yourself a laptop, buy yourself a satellite phone, send one person to somewhere in Africa, find another grade 3 class, put the computer and the satellite phone there, and then have your class and that class start to talk to each other. And the tremendous difference that those connections can make. The point being that the generation coming up is entirely comfortable with that. And it will be fascinating to see how the world changes when our ideas of geography don't make sense anymore. So the point being made is that one of the things that a short-term experience can do is give credibility, and that credibility flows partly out of skills and partly out of an increased profile. And I think there may be a certain art to arriving with prestige and leaving that behind. And that may be something that, if we are heroes from the West, if we use that to make heroic the local people that are needing to do what they need to do, that can be a tremendous benefit. It takes a certain amount of humility to leave your prestige behind.
Yeah, I agree with that, Dan, is that how do you empower the local people and the people don't just see it as though there's a bunch of Westerners here. And I totally agree with you, Allison. There's no question that you do see that we're a local organization. But the key is that you were working with a local organization. You didn't parachute in out of nowhere, do your thing, and drop and go. And I think in the early days of medical missions, that a lot of that happened. People parachuted in, did a clinic or whatever, and then buzzed off. And so I think that was a real key in the strength of what you did there. And I think sometimes too, from those kind of short-term trips, then sometimes people get ideas of how they can invest in that particular area too. I know even People's Church, there's a lady sharing about her recent trip to Malawi, and now they've started they're actually opening a home for women who've been victims of rape, and having some sort of outlet for these women. In the country, there hasn't been anything to date. And so these people are raising money for this particular center, and it's being done totally by the locals, but being sponsored by the West. Now, again, there's always that challenge, okay, well, if we're pouring money into them, what can they not get their own resources? And clearly, I think there's times where they can't. And in this situation, there's no money for women that have been raped, and in Malawi, you can be sure of that. So I think just being really discerning, I think that's the key for all of our short-term trips and all our short-term initiatives, and long-term too, is are we being discerning? And I think that's a great point that you brought out. Thank you.
So the point is made that the complication of surgery and some of those are quite long-term. If you're going to go and remove a goiter, are you doing so knowing that there is the local infrastructure to continue to monitor that patient in the longer term? I love that the hospital I was at in Swaziland had an EKG machine. The thing was massive. I think it was donated in the 70s, having been built in the 50s. And there's a lot of that in the developing world. And the machine didn't have any paper. It hadn't had paper for a couple decades. But it was there, and whichever organization had bought it I'm sure had a picture of it on the wall. Heart disease, nobody gets old enough to have heart disease, at least not women. And they're the only ones who get sick in my world. I live with the delusion that I am immortal. I've never seen many men get sick. It's that sort of thing, that the idea that you can come in and drop something off. And there's great stories of, tractors and the parts haven't applied, so somebody's got this thing rusting, and every missions hospital has got these things, where somebody had a great idea and dropped it in and left it behind. And they humor you while you're there. They keep the smile on their face. And then when you leave, they find a nice place to put it. And yes. So the question asked was how we handle drugs. And again, I think to be fair, in debates one often glosses over when it's useful for your side of the argument. So I take the point well that development and relief and aid and medical missions can be very different things. And definitely I remember a great story about how half the AIDS drugs that were available without a prescription from your friendly drug dealer in the States, where drugs are expensive, when you trace back the DINs, they had gotten to the streets of the States via Africa. They had been shipped there and then reshipped, because you can get a lot more money for those drugs in the States than you can in Africa. And anybody who does any kind of work in the developing world understands all of the realities of that. And I think organizations like CMDS have to be very careful that aid doesn't become a resource that's worth fighting over, because there's huge damage and it doesn't achieve what we want it to achieve. Again, what I would say is, do you have people on the ground who are there long term, who you trust? Do you have a chain to get it there? And do you have confidence that once it's there, it's going to be administered in a way that is effective? It was an excuse, but there was some validity to it. Nobody wanted to ship AIDS drugs to Africa because that was going to produce the more resistant strains, right? Nobody wants to ship TB drugs to places where they can't be administered because it just creates more resistant strains. Pharmaceuticals require an entire infrastructure, and if you're going to do that, then you make sure you got the infrastructure first.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes people bring medications with them when they go on short-term trips, and understanding that, maybe I like a particular drug when I'm doing, laparoscopic surgery or whatever it is that I'm doing. I understand when I bring those meds with me, I'm bringing them for that short period of time. I'm not trying to supply, the country for the next year with what's in my backpack. And quite frankly, a lot of countries are very uptight about drugs coming into their country. Like in Uganda, if a drug is anywhere close to the expiry date, it's out. Like the government will throw it out, and in fact, if you ship them, then somebody on the other end actually has to pay for those drugs to be destroyed, and it can end up being like hundreds and hundreds of dollars. I know of situations where that's happened. So you end up being a terrible burden on the other end, because some little mission hospital that you send all these meds to, they were kind of 3 or 4 months out. Well, then the government they sit in the container for 3 or 4 months, and then they're expired. So you do need to know the system. You do need to go with the laws of the land. I mean, there's certain medications that are not approved in the country, so we shouldn't be bringing those medications in. I mean, I think that's just respecting the country's laws. But certainly, small amounts of medications for the particular trip that I'm doing, I don't think there's really anything issue with that, but you just have to be realistic about what those drugs are for. So there's kind of two separate issues there, what I've got in my bag versus trying to ship a whole big container. If you're going to ship a container, make sure you know what you're doing.
That unfortunately will bring us to the end of the formal part. We do have to respect time for those, I don't know how many Maritimers there are who are feeling the time. We're monochronic, thank you. To be consistent with the worldview, the not very Christian worldview, I would argue, but that's another debate, that we all hold regarding time, we're going to wrap up. Thank you all for attending, and the discussions will continue. Thank you very much.